Good morning, everyone. We are going to give folks just another minute to log on into our webinar this morning, because I'm still seeing a stream of folks logging on. Okay, good morning. My name is Frances Contreras. I am a professor in education studies here at UC San Diego. I'm also Associate Vice Chancellor for Faculty Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion. I am thrilled to welcome you all to this morning's webinar, Racial Inequities and NIH Grant Funding. We will have an informed discussion after the talk this morning. So I'd like to turn it over and have a land acknowledgement. So next slide, please. Great. So we at UC San Diego want to acknowledge our great respect for the land and the original people of the area where our campus is located. The university was built on the unceded territory of the Kumeyaay Nation. Today, the Kumeyaay people continue to maintain their political sovereignty and cultural traditions as vital members of the San Diego community. We acknowledge their tremendous contributions to our region and thank them for their stewardship. I also want to acknowledge that we stand with our Asian American and Asian brothers and sisters this morning in the wake of the tragedy this week, but also throughout the entire year post-COVID, as well as pre-COVID. We stand with you for those of you that are part of the UCSD community, as well as the national community of scholars who have been affected, who continue to be affected by the violence against Asian Americans and the Asian community. With that, I want to turn it over to discussing our center. This talk is being sponsored by the Center for Faculty Diversity and Inclusion, which is the center led by Mardestiny Perez. She is our director, and we provide leadership and work collaboratively to cultivate an academic culture of inclusive excellence. So some of the areas of our core focus include transformational change, cultivating faculty success and leadership, fostering civility in academia, and recruiting and retaining a diverse faculty. So this is one of many events that we hold throughout the year for our faculty. I understand we may have members from the broader scholarly community, nationally and internationally. We welcome you, but this is to give you an overview of our center. Next slide, please. In terms of the Zoom community guidelines, this webinar is being recorded. Please use the Q&A feature for questions or comments. So after Dr. Taft presents his data and presentation, I will return and we will begin the moderated question and answer period. Next slide, please. Now I'd like to introduce our Vice Chancellor for Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion, Dr. Becky Pettit. She specifically asked not to include a very long bio, but I wanted to take this opportunity to really highlight some of the work that she has done for our campus and continues to engage in with our campus leaders. We've seen a tremendous sea change on our campus under her leadership as Vice Chancellor for Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion. And some of the more recent activities that we've engaged in as a team include an anti-racism series, which I know my colleague Sade is also responsible for and is on the webinar. We are, as a campus, we have engaged in a strategic planning process and now have an active strategic plan for inclusive excellence. We have an advancing faculty diversity initiative where we are among the first to engage in a cluster hire around African-American scholars in STEM, and other campuses we know are following suit, which is promising. And then we also can thank Dr. Pettit for this center. Under her leadership, several centers have unfolded and come about on our campus, including the Center for Faculty Diversity and Inclusion. And so I think it's really a testament to the fact that one person can really make a difference on campuses and institutions of higher education. And she's an example of how transformational change can occur with the right leadership in place. So thank you, Dr. Pettit. I turn it over to you to introduce Dr. Taff.
Thank you for that wonderful introduction, Francis. Good morning and welcome. Thank you all for joining us. Our topic today is disparities in NIH funding, presented by Professor Michael Taff. I'm so grateful that he has graciously offered to share his research and expertise with our campus community today. It's important for us to understand how structural and institutional bias shows up and how it impacts us as individuals and as institutions. And for those who have to confront and navigate these patterns, it's important to know what you as individuals can do to maximize your success. To this point, I invited Dr. Taff to speak on his own experience with NIH funding and to participate in a future panel discussion that will dive deeper into strategies for success. So it's my pleasure to introduce this morning Dr. Taff. He received his bachelor's degree from the Colorado College in 1990 before beginning his graduate studies in the Department of Psychology at UC San Diego. Upon earning his PhD in 1995, he completed postdoctoral work in the Department of Psychiatry at UC San Diego and in the Department of Neuropharmacology at the Scripps Research Institute. He then started his own lab at the Scripps Research Institute in 2000 with a focus on the behavioral effects of drug abuse. Professor Taff was recruited back to UC San Diego to the Department of Psychiatry and the Skaggs School of Pharmacy in 2019. So now I turn this over to you. Welcome, Dr. Taff, and thank you so much.
Thank you. Welcome, everybody. Thanks for attending, especially my friends and colleagues and interested parties from outside of UC. Unfortunately, this will be mostly focused on UCSD, but I think you will see there are tremendous parallels that you can all relate to. And thanks for the Center for Faculty Diversity and Inclusion for giving me this opportunity. So I'm going to try to do three things. An interweaving set of goals. One, to educate everybody on a grant disparity that's been identified for Black investigators at the NIH. I want to discuss the implications fairly specifically in terms of these new hiring initiatives that UCSD is engaging upon to diversify our faculty. And I'm going to weave in some description of my journey, so to speak, as a NIH grant dependent PI in the hopes that that's also informative. Okay, so starting with the scope of the situation here at UCSD. We have this diversity dashboard that anybody can look up and see things like how many Black faculty we have in biomedical disciplines, such as the School of Medicine, Biological Sciences Division, and we have 5 and 2 respectively. So, and that breaks down again in 2019, the latest data available to these 5 that are in the, shall we say, the more highfalutin tracks, and we have 7 in an adjunct track, which is our soft money track. It's a permanent career track here. It's not very many. It works out to less than 1%, less than 2% of all faculty. As was mentioned by Dr. Contreras, there is an initiative that we are fully engaged in to hire new Black faculty. We are potentially pursuing opportunities with outside funding, so from the NIH, for example, to have additional cluster hires. We have ongoing in-house programs, such as the UC President's UCSD Chancellor's Postdoctoral Fellow Program, to try to hire underrepresented postdoctoral fellows across the UCs with hiring incentives. And then there are more general attempts, such as this program of the NIH's, which attempts to help postdocs of color transition to faculty positions. So it's ongoing. And the core takeaway message for you today is that these new hiring initiatives are doomed to fail if we don't do something about the Ginther gap. Okay, so what is the Ginther gap in NIH funding? Before we get to that, I want to remind everyone that when President Joe Biden took office, on the very first day, he issued a number of executive orders, including this one, in which he said that the federal government should definitely pursue a comprehensive approach to advancing equity. He charged his administration with determining whether agency policies or actions create or exacerbate barriers to full and equal participation by all eligible individuals. And furthermore, that the head of each agency within the administration should conduct a review to try to assess whether or not underserved communities and their members face any systemic barriers in the operations of those agencies. Now, the good news for Francis Collins, who is the director of one of those agencies, the National Institutes of Health, is that that review has already been conducted. So in 2011, Donna Ginther and colleagues published this paper, which hit like a thunderclap, at least in some years, and showed that African-American PIs had a substantial disadvantage. This was followed by additional publications looking at different aspects of these findings and of this data set. And perhaps most importantly, in 2019, Travis Hopp, or Hoppy, I don't know how to pronounce it, which is kind of ironic giving my name, produced this other paper, which was basically a replication of the finding of disparity in a subsequent sample of applications. So what is the Ginther gap? So this is the original paper. And what you can see here is that for those applications, R01 applications at the NIH, they were submitted for fiscal years 2000 to 2006. If they had a white PI, they're about 29% likely to be funded. If they had a black PI, they were considerably less likely to be funded, 17%. And this works out to a 60% of the chance for black PIs, or a 1.7-fold advantage for white PIs, depending on how you like to look at it. Now, as kind of a side cautionary note, there was a significant disadvantage for Asian PIs or applications with Asian PIs, which in one of their strategies in trying to parse these data is to go until they don't find a statistically significant difference anymore. And one of the things with this population is by discriminating between those individuals who got their doctorate domestically and those that have a foreign doctorate, the effect, so to speak, partitioned to those with foreign doctorates. And they kind of abandoned this, although in the publications, as you read them, you will see little tidbits. On those two things, in large part because they did not focus on those things and because I just don't have the bandwidth. But I encourage anybody who's interested in these topics to further pursue this, because I'm here to tell you things are not just fine and dandy just because a statistically significant difference is no longer found. Okay, so as I said, in 2019, we had a replication. So despite the fact that, as many of you are aware, the success rate overall for the NIH had fallen considerably to 17.7% for applications with white PIs, there was still this remaining disparity with African-American PI applications being funded at a rate of 10.7%. And this worked out to be just about the same 60% of the chance, or a 1.7-fold advantage for white applicants, a perfect replication. This was some 15 years inclusive between the first of the Ginther sample and the last of this sample. So when I was given the opportunity to give this talk, the office of here wanted to know, well, perhaps something about my journey as I've been an investigator across this interval of time from 2000 until present, certainly the interval represented by these data sets. Wouldn't my success, so to speak, be informative about the success of investigators going forward, and particularly younger ones? I'm not particularly fond of the anecdote, as you will see, but I think there are a number of things about my story that are perhaps useful. And certainly those will jumping off points to other discussions that are probably beyond the scope of this particular talk. So I was raised academic. My dad was a college professor. And the point of this is to say that I'm relatively familiar, and have been all my life, with the general nature of US academia and the fact that dean is a 4-letter word and all that good stuff. I then went on to a small liberal arts college, as Vice Chancellor Pettit referred to. And the point of this is not the disadvantage of being in a non-research institution, but to say the advantage of having a fairly focal experience and a direct relationship with many of the professors there, which gives us familiarity. And finally, something about geography. So I grew up in central New Hampshire. I moved to Colorado Springs, Colorado, and then I landed in San Diego, California, where I've been. And this is by way of pointing out that I'm entirely comfortable operating both professionally and personally in majority white environments, and that's not going to be true for everybody. Okay, so as Dr. Vice Chancellor Pettit remarked, I did my my degree in experimental psychology here at UCSD, which in some sense is a disadvantage because it's a discipline that's kind of on the outskirts of what's traditionally funded at the NIH. It does receive funding, but may not be the core mission. My advisor was denied tenure in year 3, and this is not to say, oh, poor me, but rather to point out that I had no publications by the end of my dissertation. I did do a short postdoc. It was not what we would call completed because my advisor left for an NIH program position about 3 months into my arc here. And again, the point is that this limited my introduction to different communities of science, and I didn't have any publications. I then landed as a postdoc at Scripps Research Institute where things started going better. I started generating publishable data, started generating publications. And then my advisor left for Big Pharma in 2000. Okay, so you can see, among other things, that I'm deaf on advisors. But the way things worked at Scripps in those days, and to some extent still works here, in the Department of Psychiatry, the School of Medicine, which is why I mentioned those adjunct positions, is that I got offered the deal, which is if you can get a grant funded, you can have a lab and you can have a title. And away I went, because this happened. Then you insert a period of time of the NIH grant struggles of being a soft money investigator. So this means that someone whose job depends on having research grants, and if you don't have a research grant, you don't have a salary. Skip forward to 2019, I was recruited by the Department of Psychiatry. I was offered a half FTE, half hard money salary, which ended up not being my full salary, tenure and a full professorship. Okay, so that's me in a nutshell. As I said, I don't know that the anecdote of me is particularly helpful. The NIH receives 60,000 applications per year for possible funding from 24 institutes when there's tremendous diversity of this funding stream coming out in different ways to different people. As you're probably aware, they fund everything from basic science, clinical science, epidemiology, even treatment services. They fund research at a diversity of institutions from small liberal arts colleges to elite medical schools like the one here at UCSD, to research institutions, et cetera, companies. Maybe most importantly, the thing to keep aware of is that the NIH situation has changed tremendously over time, certainly over the 20 years or so of my career as an independent PI, and most certainly over the 30 to 40-year careers of some of our senior faculty here. So every PI has this unique pathway, and it's really hard to draw too many lessons, I would suggest. But luckily, we have the data to draw upon. Now, when the Ginther 2011 paper was published, the immediate response from many parties was, yeah, but what about, and then they would insert something they just dreamed up as being the real explanation that didn't have to do with race. These were often anecdotal, and these were often categorized, I would say, 2 different categories. Situational factors, which explain the disparity, so what kind of institution you worked at, say, and individual PI factors other than race, which show that the PI somehow deserves their fate, which could be how well you write grants, something to do with your publications, how fancy your science is. Well, as I said, Ginther already took care of this. So that's the same slide. I'm now showing you that they had a series of statistical approaches, or probit models, they call them, which is attempting to partition the variability and to excuse the disparity on the basis of other factors that showed that it wasn't about race. And so these are cumulative. They had a number of different models. They included things like if you'd been on a training grant before, or had an F-32, for example. Something about your doctoral institution, how fancy it was, basically, at NIH funding or other factors. Something about your current institution, the funding rank of your current institution, something like that. And then they started getting into things about the individual PI. So had you had previous experience as a PI? Had you been on review committees for the NIH? And then finally, this was a set of variables that tried to control for investigator productivity. So number of publications, first author, senior author, impact factor of the journals you're publishing, et cetera. But the conclusion of this came to was that despite including all these models, they were unable to explain this difference, this 10 percentage point gap, or this 1.7-fold advantage for white investigators. So those were the aggregate data. What about somebody like me? If you sort of assess anybody's career, I don't know that you can apply these things to any given individual. You look at anybody and their current success in the system or lack thereof. Maybe I didn't encounter any bias, whatever it is, whatever the quote unquote real source is. Maybe I didn't encounter that. maybe it's possible that I didn't encounter any bias, but I somehow, lucked into doing better than I actually deserved in some way, because that could happen, or worse for that matter. Maybe I sort of was subject to this bias, whatever it might be. But for whatever reason within that distribution, I did okay. Or, maybe I was in that biased population. I've been suffering it my whole career. And maybe, I did okay, but maybe I deserved better. And we just can't tell from an individual. Luckily we don't have to because of the aggregate stats. So when I tee off on the NIH grant system and how terrible it is, whether that's my own problems or whether that might be these data published by the NIH, the response is often this, which is, what are you complaining about? And it's true. I will admit, the NIH system has appeared to do very well by me, funding-wise. So this is a representation from 2000 up to 2020 of my intervals of grant funding. And the green ones are R1s where I was the PI. And what you can see is that I've had, reasonably good outcomes. What I want to point out to you when you assess these anecdotes is that this is what you see. You see, when you see a depiction like this, or you've rushed over a reporter to show why I'm ridiculous, you see this duck floating around on the water looking very serene. And what you don't see is the furiously churning feet underneath keeping this duck moving. One of my very good friends and colleagues, and indeed mentors in this business, once observed that I work harder at this than anyone he knows. Now, I don't know if this is true. All I know is how hard I work. But luckily, we don't have to rely on the anecdote of me. So even in this Ginther publication in 2011, we saw that they reported that applications from Black and indeed Asian investigators were less likely to receive funding the first time. So in the NIH system, you submit a proposal, it gets reviewed. If it doesn't get funded, you can revise it, resubmit it. Back then, you were allowed to do that 2 times. They were still cleaning out some backlog of a previous era when it was more than 2 times. And they showed that Black investigators, if they were to be funded, had to submit that application more times. And sort of interestingly, or harrowingly, I would say, for whatever reasons, Black and indeed Hispanics were less likely to resubmit revised applications. And this is something that we need to think about as we look forward to hiring new people. Okay, so I'm gonna give you a little flavor about what some of this looks like from my career. So, this was my first grant award. It was awarded for 3 years. We had a no-cost extension. We'd submitted this thing, and I say we, because this grant was originally submitted with the PI of my previous postdoctoral advisor, with her as the PI, and it was reviewed that way, and it got scored that way. Now, at NIH, which some of you are maybe not aware of, but hopefully you're all aware of, grants are awarded to the institution. So UCSD, Scripps Research Institute, et cetera, not to the PI, which means the institution can say, we want to change the PI to somebody else, which happens, not all the time, but commonly. And so the first response of the National Institute on Drug Abuse was, we'll give you half the money because we don't know this guy. And I was like, well, did you notice this was for a monkey project? They're a very expensive research model, and I can't buy them for this kind of price, so you have to give me the full amount. And they said, fine, we'll cut you by a year from our 4-year proposal down to a 3-year proposal. What was I going to do? I had to take it, but I did point out that, we trained these animals for 2 years before we started doing research, and that was cutting my research time in half. No avail. Got my research lab started. We started making some papers come out. Came back after this interval of funding with a competing continuation application not discussed. So not discussed means the review panel feels like this is in the bottom half of the applications they have in front of them that's not even worth talking about. It's a pretty bad outcome. So that happened with a revision. Okay, no problem. I was new in my career. Other projects were going on. And this is about this project right here, where I put in the first proposal. It got scored, a pretty good score, not fundable. No problem, put it in again. 1.6 percentile, low single digits, which is about as best as you can do. Probably got the top score in that study section for that round. Fine, away we went, got funded for 5 years, came back with a competing continuation, not discussed, very poor score. All right, that's not the half of it, of course, because along in there, one of the things I was doing is that some things came out of this original sort of pursuit of this project, which kind of deserved their own funding. And there's part of an overall strategy of trying to stay funded in this system is making sure you have overlapping grants on the same project. So we were putting in other proposals, on a related topic. Not discussed, a bad score, not discussed with a new version after I was unable to keep revising them. So in a sense, for this one interval of funding in this sort of research program, I had to put in all these applications. Some of my pathways have been a little bit more linear. So this is another set of projects where it was scored not very good, started to creep down, scores crept down. So down is better, of course, if I didn't mention that. This is another one that's getting closer. Finally, you get down to an 8.9 percentile, which was well within the pay line at that time, get funded, 5 years of funding, we published some papers, gotten some data together, came back, not discussed. So this happens. I'm not going to belabor the rest of these things. These are all sort of linear projects. But the point is that for the relatively rare intervals of funding that you see above the water here, there's always the duck's feet churning with an awful lot of applications that were not successful. All right. I want to talk about an intersectional issue. So one of the responses I often get when I'm complaining about my life is that, well, you're a man, you at least don't face the known gender discrimination in the academy. But one of the Ginther papers addressed that, and so I'm going to do a little bit on that. So there's a follow-up paper, and they wanted to know if there was a double bind for women of color. And so what you're seeing here is I'm presenting the application award probability, which I showed you at the top, the per applicant award probability, which I didn't show you, is a slightly different take on this issue. What you see is across PhDs and MD holding PIs, the white to black disparity more or less persists unchanged. But the takeaway for this particular focus was that the fate of women, so these two bars, was not any worse. Okay. So, but there's tidbits sprinkled throughout these papers, which is why I advise you to read them very closely and repeatedly. And one thing that came up was this idea of survivor bias. So this is the famous depiction of survivor bias, where it's the an attempt by engineers to look at the damage that was suffered by planes coming back from sorties in World War II to try to figure out how they could increase survivability. And of course, some brilliant engineer said, no, we don't need to focus on the areas where they come back shot up. We need to focus on the areas where they're not shot up. And the reason why is because if they get shot up, they don't come back. They don't survive. This has implications for careers and especially new hires. So this was analysis in this paper of the male-female gap. And they were looking at young, under the age of 50, yes, investigators who submitted just one single application and never came back. And so women were 2.7 percentage points more likely to do that than men. The black PhDs, the cross-sex, were 16.7 percentage points more likely to submit only a single unfunded proposal. So this echoes the stat I reported to you before about needing to revise proposals to get funded. All right, so one of the major takeaways from this at this point is that, if initiatives that we have to hire for diversity, to diversify this campus, are to work, we need to think about survivorship. And we have to set the stage for these individuals to have sustained high volume grant submitting activity in the biomedical sciences. So jumping back to the blame the victim, as I call it, or that people deserve their fate because they're just not good enough scientists. Why did they do 2018 after the original Ginther thing concluded that these metrics of productivity didn't really contribute to explain the gap? Well, the director, Francis Collins, the same one we have now, established a committee who said, well, but our ability to distinguish between our hypotheses, i.e. to support our pet hypothesis, was insufficiently explained by the variables that were available to us, and so we needed to do this new thing. And so they randomly sampled 600 out of 2,400 applications from those grant proposals, but they used the interval of time that was only in the second half of the Ginther sample. They said because that's how they could get the right information, but you got to read these things with a little bit of a skeptical eye. So this is NIH data. Sorry, I had to put in some labels here so you could see what was going on. But this is success rates for new R01s and for competing continuation R01s for men and women across time from 98 to 2019. The Ginther sample is here, the Hoppe sample is here. What you see is in this reanalysis, they took the second half of the Ginther sample in which success rates were in transition. We don't know what the impact of that is. We don't know what the impact of this subsampling is, but they managed to find a significant result and publish it. Some of us would call that p-hacking. All right. And they concluded, so they found this statistically significant explanation, so to speak, but they said that these improved measures explain half the gap. Well, that leaves half the gap unexplained. So half of this gap is still unexplained by this reanalysis. And as I said, there's always little tidbits buried in here. So one of the things that's instructive for us is that they discovered in this analysis that while Black investigators have published the same number of publications as trainees, those papers got fewer citations. This gap widened when they became PIs, and they had fewer co-authors publishing the top quartile of their field, and smaller professional networks that they concluded may constrain publication counts, citations, and research impact. May constrain. Well, of course it constrains that. So there are a couple points here. One is that if our initiatives are to succeed, we have to set the stage for collaboration and cooperation within departments and interest areas within the university. And, again, the anecdote of me, this has nothing to do with me personally, but when I was a graduate student here, we had two brand new assistant professors that were hired for diversity purposes. And they were literally put in the basement, ignored, and essentially told by a skeptical department, show us that you belong here, prove it. We can't do that. This is the same slide, but another conclusion point, which is that, and this is a little more complex. So we have to realize that what we think of as being merit of citations, of counts, of fanciness of publications, they are not objective. They depend on funding. So citations are a function of how many papers are being published that generate citations in a subfield. That depends on funding, depends on the number of people that are interested in those subfields, and it depends on a very long tail, potentially, of people who have been trained by professors in those fields, gone on to faculty positions of their own right, and generated research programs. So, this gets back a little bit to the anecdote of me, and this is a sort of cautionary tale. We don't always think of these things. As I said, I got a late start publishing. I had a monkey model for a long time, but was not fast at generating data. I have relatively low publications for my duration of this career. One of the things to point out is I publish very few reviews. The point of this is that reviews are citation generators. I do okay if you look at things on their improved metrics of first and senior author publications. But one thing they don't mention is middle author publications, which is kind of ignored as not being, awesome. But these are citation generators, and citation generators that happen at very little cost and effort to the people, or less effort, I should say, the people who are participating. So don't do this. There's another point here. So this is my citations over time. You can see it took a while for my publications to get up to appreciable levels, but I just want to point out two things, or one thing really, is that there was this trend line early in my career when I was mostly publishing with non-human primate models. And there was this trend line when I started publishing with rodent models. And for the same exact investigator working in basically the same areas of research on more or less the same questions, the change of model species has a tremendous impact on citations. And you can see that in individual paper trajectories as well. Okay, so that brings us back to this idea of topic choice and what people choose to work on. Models, yes, but more broadly speaking. And so the big thing of this replication study in 2019 was not just the replication, but they used a sort of fancy informatics approach to cluster applications by their topics. And they could then rank these into 150 topic-based clusters, which they could then sort by the probability of award within those clusters, how successful topics were likely to be at the NIH. And what they found at the top line is that 37.5% of applications from Black PIs mapped to just 8 of these topic clusters. And of those 8, 6 had award rates that were lower than average for the NIH. Aha, they said. It's just that these applicants are applying to the wrong, or in the wrong topic domains that aren't funded very well. Well, hidden in this data set, and they did admit this in the paper, but it doesn't pop up in the top line reporting, is that, of course, because it's based on success of these clusters and white applicants are the vast majority of applicants, white applicants in these clusters do more poorly as well, but they still do better than the Black applicants. And so I've graphed data that was buried in a table in supplement table 6 of this publication. And what you can see is if you group these 150 topic-based clusters into quintiles, rank them based on success rates. So again, the white applicants are mostly driving the story here. There's this nice linear trend, of course. And across every single one of these topic quintiles, African-American investigator applications do more poorly. And they concluded, this was top line, the paper that Dave explained, 20% of the funding gap by topic choice, but that leaves 80% of that gap unexplained, the vast majority of it unexplained. There was another implication of this study, which was something that I've come late to and really takes a while to grapple with, which is the following. Suppose that those topics that are of interest, disproportionate interest to PIs submitting to the NIH who are African American and Black, who happen to be only 2% of the applicants. What if they map disproportionately onto those topics that are of interest to the broader African American community, statistically speaking, which is 14% of the US population? Well, now we have a problem that goes to systemic health disparity, right? Where research on the health concerns of taxpaying, by the way, people of color, is less common, less well-funded, and therefore it reduces identification, detection, remediation, cures, et cetera, for those health concerns. And I should point out that there's a preprint, which presumably they're going to try to publish, from the head of the Office of Extramural Research at the NIH, suggesting this is indeed true. Okay. So, what can we do, or what can be done to address this disparity of funding based on research topic interests? The process of review at NIH is inherently conservative, by which I mean that you have to have an R01 or equivalent to then be a reviewer on these panels of subsequent R01 applications. And so ultimately the major input to what gets funded is being conducted by people who have been selected by the system as being congruent with the system, or molded into the form by hard experience. Review is subjective. I mean, so for those of us that have been on multiple, review panels, if we're honest with ourselves, we recognize this. We are supposed to assess things like significance. Well, what does significance mean? Innovation, same. And if the approach is good, well, scientists vary in terms of what they think are good approaches. That can be something as simple as model species, like the monkeys versus rats I was describing in my career, or anything else that we have to do with research. And so again, there's this inherent conservatism, and despite the fact that NIH panel rules require some nod to diversity in terms of the geographic location of the institution, sex, race of the PI, it can't oppose this inherent cycle of conservatism. And by the way, only about 2% of reviewers are African American or Black. So there's no way that can provide reasonable balance. Okay, so what does it take to overcome this inherent inertia? All right, so I'm gonna indulge myself in one of these anecdotes to explain to you how things are supposed to work when you're trying to get a topic funded that may not be of interest to the system at current time. Back in 2008, 2009, the cathinone derivatives came to broad attention because of use in the UK of a substance that was called plant food, meow meow, 4-methylmethcathinone and ephedrine. And it was clear that it was MDMA-like, and it was clear that it wasn't schedule controlled, or it wasn't made illegal there, so it was free and easy to have and consume. In 2010, we had a little sort of echo of that in the US with something that was called bath salts. And then this sort of reached a pinnacle with a report in 2014. I may be off by a year by this, but of Flocka, which is one of these compounds, blowing up in South Florida, having some very bizarre public behavior in people. And there was some allegation that perhaps they were ingesting this with e-cigarette-like devices. So as someone who was already interested in the amphetamine stimulants, so MDMA and methamphetamine, and has an unhealthy interest in what the kids these days are doing when it comes to my research interests, we had a question about, are these MDMA-like, are they cocaine-like, are they meth-like, do they have those same dangers and toxicities and abuse liabilities? What are these dangers? That's where I come to play. That is what I'm supposed to be doing as an academic scientist working for the taxpayers. So I did what you were supposed to do, which is call your program officer. So I did that in 2010, said I'm interested. She was a program officer who was interested in MDMA issues back in the day. But she basically said there's not really a lot of enthusiasm here at NIDA for anything that's not in the director nor Volkov's priority list at the time. Well, I didn't give up. I emailed some more people. I talked to them in person at an academic meeting that I attend every year. And I sort of got the same conclusion, which is get a fundable score out of a study section and then maybe we'll talk. Okay. There was a kind of hilarious, I thought, standoff between Drug Enforcement Administration individuals who were desperate for information on all these compounds. There's a diversity of them because they had to take scheduling actions or not take scheduling actions, and they wanted data. And NIDA's position was basically, well, if you guys want to fund it, we'll do it. And so it wasn't just me who thought this was important. All right, so I put in an application, and frankly, I'm here to tell you this is the best proposal I have ever created at the NIH, the best program of study I've ever written. Not discussed, revised it, not discussed. I think at this point in time, they'd disallowed 2 revisions, and you might, as a kind of a sidebar, ask yourself why post-Ginther, when they had that report that the disparity was exacerbated by needing to revise proposals, why did they terminate the ability to revise proposals so much? But you had to put in new proposals, not discussed, not discussed. And along in here at the same time, I was throwing some of these ideas into my MDMA non-human primate renewal, not discussed, bad score, an exercise proposal that was very much on Volkoff's radar at that point in time. She's very interested in the effects of exercise to ameliorate drug abuse, not discussed. And hilariously, sort of to echo this conservatism review, I was told, why are you looking at this new compound? Because we don't know much about it. Why don't you use methamphetamine? So of course we did that. We abandoned the caffeine in this proposal. We've been working on some anti-drug vaccines. We've been working on some vapor inhalation techniques, which sort of echoed with this suggestion that people in South Florida who were doing a very bizarre public behavior have been ingesting this with e-cigarettes. Nothing. Okay. Finally, the NIH came to play. And so they issued a program announcement saying, yes, we'd like to get some of these proposals on synthetic drugs, please. Cathinones, yes. Cannabinoids, opioids. They immediately pulled it for PAR. So this gets a little bit into the technical weeds, but what this means is that instead of these proposals going into standard study sections, they were allowed to convene special emphasis panels, which presumably had some affection for the topic. Why did they do this? I don't know, but I do know after I saw this program announcement, I immediately sent a vast collection of these summary statements that I received and said, you're not going to do very well if these don't go in special emphasis panels. Things got a little better. We started getting scored, not fundable. There was an opportunity in here to apply for bridge funding, which didn't get scored or didn't get funded. But at 18 percentile, which was clearly outside of the funding, I had submitted yet another revision. When they told me 2 weeks later, they're going to pick this up with end of year funding. Good, off to the races. All of this effort to end up with 1 interval of funding. Okay, so does this matter? I mean, yes, it's annoying for someone like me that I'm at a disadvantage in securing grant funds. But it matters more systematically. So here are something to do with the advancement criteria here in my department of psychiatry, where at the 4th year review, assistant professors are told that their active research support is desired, that they have to have publication productivity and develop an independent research program. These are very much helped, as you can imagine, by independent research funding. By the time it is the tenure bar itself, to get associate professor, you need to have active research grant support, independence, and continued productivity. And along these lines, if you want to accelerate, if you want to do better than others and get more salary, for example, you have to have exceptional research productivity, including research grants specified exactly, specifically. And there's even this thing about if you want to accelerate or you want to have credit for acceleration in the service area, being appointed earlier than expected to a prestigious society such as the ACMP. And if you go on the web and look at the ACMP's frequently asked questions list, having an R01 grant is a necessary bar of membership, right? So these things are buried everywhere. I'm going to flip through these quickly because these are just, you Google the web, something to do with this, and you'll pull these up over and over again. This is the New York University School of Medicine. This is the Chemical Physics Faculty Handbook of Kent State, Tulane School of Medicine, Duke School of Medicine. They all come to the same conclusion, which is that obtaining research funding, major research funding, often specified as NIH and even the R01, is basically a requirement to be made associate professor and get tenure. And the sustained pattern of funding with NIH awards is basically an expectation for full professors as well throughout the duration of the career in biomedical science disciplines. So, what does it take to overcome this? I've given you some flavor of this, but I do want to point out one key thing, which took me a long time to face. So when I was a naive assistant professor, I knew that about a 20% hit rate or so was the success rate at the NIH, that, I just have to write 5 grants and I have a fighting chance. This is not the way it works. So the cumulative probability of award, which is your chance of at least one hit given a number of tickets or applications in this case, works like this. So if we start with the award probabilities that were reported in this 2019 hot paper, for white investigators, it takes 5 applications, you're up to about a 60%-ish cumulative probability award. And if you put in 10 applications, you're up to 85. Now, of course, this is no guarantee. But if you start off at a disadvantage, it's going to take 4 more applications and 8 more applications to equal that same cumulative probability. And as you know, that takes time. It takes time, it takes effort. They don't write themselves. And you can't just endlessly revise the same proposal. You have to generate preliminary data that will support those proposals. So we're in the home stretch here. The lessons for our new hires and our diversity efforts are as follows. If they are to succeed, they need much more time to write proposals, to revise and resubmit. That means they need more startup money to develop to preliminary studies. They need more trainees in their laboratories, which may be graduate program support, it may be training grants, T32s, whatever, it might be other programs. They need more people to generate those preliminary studies. Ultimately, this boils down to runway. They need more runway to sustain that initial laboratory growth for years to generate those proposals. I mentioned that it would be advantageous to establish these non-exploitative collaborations with established faculty. Yes, we know that's often popular for departments to hire a new penny who has a new technique that they want to use. We need to make sure that these collaborations are actually not just two-way, but are actually beneficial to the new hires. As I said, most distressing and most difficult, we have to at an institutional level recognize the fate of these individuals in the context of our tenure decisions. And then finally, it's worth keeping in mind that there's pieces in these prior reports that suggest that the disparity still exists for full professors, it still exists for those with grant experience and those that work in the right quote unquote topics for the right methodologies, which is a favorite term of NIH Director Collins. Okay. Back to the anecdote of me and hiring initiatives. So I want to point out that you can do things like not just show the number of grant awards, we can add up the number of dollars, and that's very attractive to hiring institutions when you're at a mid-career juncture, as I was. That's all very well and good. But what most of you don't know is that in my history, since I've been here at town, I trained here in UCSD. There's a lot of folks here at UCSD who knew me and knew of me. They are aware of my race, and they could be generally aware of my science and my science journey. My recruitment here started as an attempt to do an 8-lab cluster hire, which basically had nothing to do with me. It had to do with an initiative in substance abuse. Interestingly, the Center for Faculty Diversity and Inclusion was entirely unaware that I was on the table until I approached them. And when I asked the department, like, why didn't you go to them? And so, it was twofold here. One, just to advantage my own hire, to do as best I could for myself. But also, a department I was joining, it was going to save them money if there was some other institutional source that could chip in, right? So then the department told me, well, they didn't do anything for us last time, I guess when they last had a Black professor on the line. And so we didn't bother going to this time. And there's a couple of takeaway messages here. I don't know exactly what happened. But certainly UCSD needs to up its game on targets of opportunity. We are talking about low single-digit faculty that are Black in the academy, and certainly here in biomedical sciences. And if we're going to do better, we can't just groom a pipeline. We got to go out and look it. And then the efforts, when somebody's on the table, we have to more consistently engage our diversity offices, our apparatus that is dedicated to this to try and land these people. So when I present these data, I often get questions from people, white faculty, other faculty, what can we do? Well, I think the most important thing is educate yourself, and that's part of what I'm doing here today, but I want to encourage you to read these NIH publications, including the supplements, importantly, carefully and repeatedly. To discuss them once you're sort of conversant with what's going on in these data. Discuss these with your colleagues, with your departments, and with your academic societies. If you're really motivated, maybe publish some letters or commentaries in your society journal to make it even more salient to your academic societies. And as you discuss, or as you have your conversations with representatives in NIH, whether that be your program officers about your grants, whether it be SROs, as you're serving on study sections under them, or even directors that you happen to, of the ICs that you happen to be chumming with, ask them what they're doing about the Ginther gap. You know, how does it look in their domains? So just to draw your attention, for those of you who don't know, I recently published this feature article in eLife with Nick Gilpin, which goes over some of these details and these arguments a little more specifically. That's a good place to start. There was a really excellent commentary published in Cell a couple weeks ago by some Black biomedical engineers, including I think 2 on this campus. It was also really excellent. It's more directed call for action from the NIH than we took on. And then you can call your congressional delegation. So normally when you're told, talk to your congressional delegation, somebody's asking you to beg for money from the NIH. But you can also ask about this funding disparity, what they're doing importantly about that topic disparity that has implications for communities of color, who are, by the way, taxpayers. For my local audience, I want to point out that Scott Peters has UCSD and La Jolla Institute in his district. Mike Levin has SALT, TSRI, the Sanford Burnham Institute. Our newest congressional delegate from the county, Sarah Jacobs, has SDSU, and as you all know, she has a familial affiliation with UCSD. And then even if Juan Vargas's district doesn't have any major grant recipients in it, certainly he has numerous STEM workers in his district, including many probably who are funded by the NIH. So talk to them. I have a couple kind of closing disjointed conclusions. One observation from some of this is that training history or experience with the NIH was no help. So having F-32 experience, having K-99, that's great. It is good in a lot of ways, but it doesn't overcome the bias entirely. As I said at the top when I inserted that extra slide, you know, these analysis and the talk about it has given very short shrift to funding gaps for Asian PIs and for Hispanic PIs. I think that requires, or would recommend some additional inquiry. I certainly believe that these kinds of disparities are still present for these populations, even if they may be of small magnitude and disappear into statistical insignificance in some analyses. It is very unlikely that this is only limited to NIH. We only know about this ones because they coughed up the data and provided the analysis. It's very lucky that these problems are present at NSF, other funding agencies, private, smaller and larger. So be aware of that. I was trying to think if I could sort of conclude some of these anecdotal survival of me conclusions, and it's a very long discussion, but suffice it to say, one thing that many of you are aware of, but others may not be, is that mentoring is insufficient. Telling people what to do is not going to cover it. Sponsorship is what makes the difference. Sponsorship is what led me to being the one who was off in the lab when our PI left and there were 4 postdocs. Sponsorship is what happens when the NIH says, we don't want to substitute the PI on that particular ward, and powerful people go to bat for you and say, yeah, he can do it. I mean, I know he looks like he's a chump as far as publications go, but we know him and he's a good dude. Sponsorship is essential. Money matters, full stop. The reason I was hired here, was offered a job here, had to do with that vast pile of grant funding. There's no doubt about that. One thing that's a little bit hard is that there's a tendency for institutions to want to ride to the rescue after it's been proven that there's some kind of a problem or some trouble. And this is suboptimal. What is better is to be proactive and to make sure that individuals have what they need to survive from the start, and not try to be chintzy and not try to be efficient, but to make sure if you are going to throw down for a new hire that you give them everything they need to succeed. Okay, more generally, drifting away from the anecdote of me, there are some things we need to think about here at UCSD as we try to do cluster hiring, as we try to diversify the faculty. What job categories are we hiring into? Are they going to be the soft money tracks? I think there's room for that. Obviously, I had a very successful, start to my career that way. Or are we going to hire into full-time equivalency tracks where there's hard money, either partial or whole? And even if there's some expectation of salary cover, how is that going to work? What are the conditions we're setting for these new hires? There are considerations about who we are hiring. This is a very, very long conversation that dates back to discussions I've had on institution committees back when I was an undergraduate. What's their right background? What's their scientific training? What are their networks? What are their topic preferences? As I showed you through the course of this talk, these things matter for their success, at least in the NIH game. Whether we like it or not, there's some practical issues here. Scientific personalities. I mean, so, as you've seen, it takes resilience. We all talk about this, but I hope I've shown to you that we're not just talking about normal resilience. As I've often remarked to people, if I have one sole talent for this business, it's my ability to take a punch career-wise. And I think we need to think about these issues when we do hires. Conversely, we need to set circumstances so that people don't have to take a punch in order to survive. All right, and then sort of on a tactical basis, once you've selected someone or hired someone or made an offer, you need to ask if we're setting them up for success. And as I said, it boils down to runway. Have you given them the time, the startup funding, the trainees, and the collaborative networks where they're going to succeed? And then 2, does the institution have a recognition, a real recognition of what it takes for these individuals to succeed given these grant biases? All right, thank you for attending. Most of you know how to contact me if we don't have time for your particular questions, whether that be on Twitter or by email. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Taff. We really appreciate your informative remarks today. If I could, it would be great. We have some questions already coming through the chat. I'm going to give you a chance to grab some water. Feel free to submit your questions. My colleague is monitoring the chat as well. I'm going to go ahead and jump in. The first question is related to the Ginther gap. So why is NIH reluctant to use affirmative action and targeted opportunity type solutions to address the Ginther gap? What constitutes the inertial barrier, internal from NIH and federal policy and or external from the wider research community? Who would be proposal reviewers?
Hi, Roberta. Yes, so this comes up, it comes up in a lot of discussions, and in particular, people are very keen to make the parallel between what the NIH has done for early stage investigators, young investigators, in terms of basically naked, top-down, heavy-handed, quota-based affirmative action, which is what they did for early stage investigators, with none of this analysis, none of this discussion about what the real cause is. Why can't they just do this? So, I don't know specifically, but it is almost inevitable. The real explanation has to do with the fact that NIH is running in fear of Congress and in fear of right-wing political entities that are against affirmative action in general. And so you will hear them say things like, we can't do that, Congress won't let us, it's against the law. And much like we have experienced here at the UC in the wake of Ward Connerly's pushing through that initiative that banned affirmative action in the University of California hiring back in the 90s, UC found a way to accomplish their same goals somewhat in the context of those rules, and the NIH hasn't done that. And the question is why, and I don't know. You can draw your own conclusions. The NIH funds a lot of things out of order. They fund a lot of things in various ways. And they could have done this very, very quietly, at the very least, made their PR look good by making that gap go away. They just haven't done it. So practically speaking, I would say, again, when you're talking to NIH representatives, you're talking especially to congressional delegations, ask why this can't be done, why this hasn't been done, and demand that it be done. That's really the answer that I have.
Mm-hmm. Okay, that's great. And I have one more question coming in, and that is, given the very small number of Black PIs, to simply increase the Black PI R01 success rate to match white PIs costs almost nothing. Why do you think NIH refuses to do this like they have for new investigators?
Yeah, that's sort of the same answer.
Okay.
Which is that I think they're afraid to do so. And I think, one of the important differences there, again, it's sort of, it's a matter of viewpoint and definition. And I think one thing that'd be very useful is to stop construing this as if, we have to give help to African-American PIs and rather start looking at this as being this unearned advantage for white PIs that they've existed with for 2 decades now, and ask, why are they being permitted on the basis of their race to have an advantage? And if we turn the discussion to that, then all of a sudden these arguments about how it's illegal to fund grants on the basis of race sort of actually is an advantage.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, can you clarify for the audience if the reviewing process from NIH applications is completely anonymous?
So no, it's not.
Okay.
Um, and I don't think it can be unless we have a very radical change in the way things are done, just because it's, attempts to anonymize applications that they've tried this, they've had little trials, and they've failed and laughably failed. Um, because again, it's very difficult to do. And, ultimately, I think what I talked about later on, this HOP study with the topics-based disparity, it shows you how much more complicated this is beyond even the aspect of individual racial characteristics of the PI. And it may be that it's just that systemically, topics that are of interest to these people are being underrepresented, are being underfunded. And as I alluded to, there's this preprint that's being pushed around that will focus on the success rate within individual institutes and centers of the NIH. And one of the things they focus on is the relatively high number of applications to the National Institute on Minority Health and Health Disparities and the low success rates. And what they've ignored is that institute has a tiny, tiny fraction of the budget, 0.8%. And so these are more systemic allocation issues that I think need to be addressed. And it's about anonymization, it's about making the system more fair for all.
Mhm. So I wanted to switch it up a little bit and move to the institutional implications. One of the things that one of our efforts, as you know, through the Center for Faculty Diversity and Inclusion is, of course, education of our faculty, but also we actually directly advocate and provide real-time support for our faculty and faculty of color through our networks, through our women's network. But sometimes departments don't contact us, right? And so that's why we have our faculty equity advisors to be on the ground to let us know if anyone's at risk of other institutions are trying to steal our star faculty. But it speaks for the potential to ensure, not only with these new hires, but with departments, to ensure that there's a more systematic approach to retention, that we have this transparent onboarding, as you know from your own experience. And so I think that there are some definite lessons to be learned. So say we also have offices for grants. We have these offices for grant proposals and grant development for these large scale grants. What can be done at the institutional level in terms of these additional offices, like these grant seeking sources, like these, institutional offices that exist to support our faculty with grants? What types of supports might they be able to provide for the senior scholar, but as well as the junior scholar? Because sometimes those senior scholars are preferenced because they're able to go for those larger $20 million grants. Can you comment on that?
Um, yes and no. No, because hopefully I gave you a flavor of the fact that I don't feel like I've solved this system. I don't feel like I have any answers. I don't feel like I have any ways to make things better. I try to give you a flavor of how, over the course of my career, I've kind of walked the steps of what you're supposed to do, and I've had the outcome I've had. My only core understanding of the system is you got to keep the grants flying out the door. You got to keep battering if you hope to have any success against the odds that are against you. And so that backs up to answer your question. Whatever facilitates people keeping the grants flying out the door is what helps them to succeed. And so yes, to some extent early on, some basic education in the NIH grant process is helpful. But ultimately, that tends to go down a rabbit hole of the misperception that if you just write better grants, you're going to have better success outcomes. And as a reviewer, over a long interval of time now of NIH grants, it's not about quote unquote better grants as a document on the page.
Mm-hmm. Right. So also, as a woman of color and as a senior scholar myself, I've been told throughout my career, which is I think somewhat of your experience, that whatever you're told for merit and promotion, double it. Right. And that's been my practice as a scholar. And I think that your record of grant seeking and the volume of grants that you have produced and continue to produce suggests the same. And I wanted to know if you could comment on, I worry about that messaging as well for our junior scholars. Like, that's not equity, right? Just telling them to double it and you're going to have to work harder and smarter. So I think about, like, what are the possibilities with this new collaboration, for example, How can we ensure that individually we set them up for success, which is what you alluded to, but as a collaboration, as a cluster of 13 faculty in STEM, we do that with them and in partnership with these scholars.
Um, I mean, obviously, we're at a crossroads where institutions, including the NIH, are finally getting serious about these issues. And it may be, hopefully in the future that things will change and everything will be fine and dandy. I have my skepticism. And, I think in terms of advice for new hires, I mean, one of the things, not to be too critical, but this new cluster hire initiative that we have underway right now um, insists that these are individuals who should be hired focusing on issues of interest to African Americans. So in the parlance of this talk I just gave you, if anybody's going to be hired in the School of Medicine, presumably they're going to be individuals who focus on health disparities and health disparities of interest to African Americans, which is great and it's awesome. But what I've just told you is that they have an even steeper road potentially compared to somebody who happens to be African American who works in one of those topic domains that has the very highest success rates, right? That was identified in Hoppe et al. So this is the kind of duality, right? Of wanting an individual to be successful versus wanting to contribute in a broader way to the diversity and equity within the University of California, San Diego. And it's tough to know which way to jump on those issues.
Right. So I just wanted to clarify. So the AFD grant actually is a cluster hire grant that's focused on a joint partnership with African American Studies and the African diaspora in the United States. How it's been interpreted, right, by some of our STEM colleagues is that there should be a focus on health disparities. Certainly that's one topic area, but they're not limited to focusing on health disparities per se. Right, we haven't predetermined as a AFD committee in any way what the research is, but the connection should be really to be able to contribute to the African American Studies minor and now new major. So there is some wiggle room. And so you're pointing to an area that we can be proactive on in terms of educating to broaden the array of topics that are considered. So thank you for that. One question that came through, and this will be the last question if that's okay. Much of the discussion was anchored to and revolves around grant funding, which we know has a tons of biases and other issues. Instead of trying to patch it with Band-Aid solutions, shouldn't we also be discussing better metrics, like how merit is defined?
Right. So, I mean, I probably, I a little bit, I don't know if I oversold or undersold. I mean, obviously, the reason why I kept saying things like almost a requirement for tenure is because whenever this comes up, some senior member of my department is quick to jump in and say, having grants is not actually a requirement. But what is a requirement is scholarly activity, which in biomedical science disciplines means publishing scientific papers, generating independent research program, et cetera, et cetera. And I'm drawing that connection to saying, I just don't see how in the parlance of biomedical science careers, that happens without money. So it doesn't have to be grants. It could be that you were an HHMI investigator or something and never had to write a grant, fine, but it takes money. And so these things, in my mind, in my experience in biomedical disciplines and US institutions, it depends on the money. You can't do those things. You can't succeed. You can't have better metrics of publication productivity success without that coming from substantial research funding. So yes, it is true. I alluded to this idea of what we consider to be publication metrics and how those are tied to research networks and the size of your discipline. And that we can improve upon and recognize better, but it's not that grants are the measure, it's just they're necessary for the other measures. So they might as well be a measure, if we're honest.
Great. Well, you've given us a great deal to consider and also helpful feedback to give back to our campus in many ways. So we just want to thank you for your time, for your critical reflection, not only on your own journey, but also of the NIH. This has been extremely informative. For those of you that have attended, thank you so much for attending. We have a quick survey of the utility of our event this morning, and we'd love your feedback. And I believe it's already posted in the chat. Thank you so much, Dr. Taff. We look forward to engaging with you in the near future.
Thank you for the opportunity. Thank you for coming all.
Thank you all.